Greetings, everyone, from coming to you from New York City and Michigan. Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's presentation of Mayank Kumar's research paper entitled Getting Dirty Before You Get Clean: Institutional Investment in Fossil Fuels and the Green Transition. Mayank's research was recognized as this year's winner of the 4th annual Sustainable Finance in Fixed Income Research Competition. This was sponsored by the Fixed Income Analyst Society, FIASI, together with Fordham University's Center for Research in Contemporary Finance and the O'Shea Center for Credit Analysis and Investment, part of the Gabelli School of Business. My name is Henry Schilling, and I'm a FIASI board member. On behalf of FIASI's entire board of directors and the Fordham University's Gabelli School of Business, I want to thank you all for attending this presentation and to congratulate Mayank on his well-deserved award. FIASI and Fordham launched this competition 4 years ago, and this year we received a total of 24 submissions. These were reviewed by a committee consisting of 8 individuals. Lauren, if you can advance the slide. I'm not going to refer to their positions, but I'll mention their names. At the Fordham University side, Srish Chatterjee, John Finnerty, who is not only a professor of finance at Fordham University, but also a FIASI Hall of Famer, as well as Yan. On the FIASI side, Mark Howard, as well as Maria Rosa Verdi, and myself, Henry Schilling. And this year we added 2 additional members to our committee. The first one is Amy Levine, and the second is Stephen Libertor. Steve is with Nuveen, and he today co-manages the largest sustainable fixed income fund. We also designated, as a committee, we also designated 2 runners-up, and I'd like to mention them. The first one is Zimin Chen, a Ph.D. in finance candidate with the University of Lausanne and Swiss Finance Institute. And the second one is Xiang Li with the Carroll School of Management of Boston College, who is also a Ph.D. candidate. Congratulations to them as well. Before I turn to Srish Chatterjee to introduce Mayank and then lead the Q&A, a session that will follow Srish's remarks, I just want to add that we're recording the presentation, and the recording will be posted on our website afterwards, along with copies of Mayank's research, along with the research of the papers that were recognized as the runners-up. We encourage your comments and questions. You can direct these to Srish by using the Q&A button on the lower part of your screen. Thank you again. And with this, I'd like to turn the discussion over to Srish, and then I'll come in at the very end to make some concluding remarks. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Henry, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's event. This is the high point of our annual competition that Henry has already described to all of you. I just wish to mention 3 points before leaving the stage for Mayank. I don't want to take too much of your time. You're all here to listen to the presentation. Just want to mention that this competition is announced sometime in October, November every year, and it is open to undergraduate, graduate, and PhD students. The PhD students from both United States, inside United States, and outside of United States can apply. Particularly this year, we had applications and submissions from PhD students outside of United States. The purpose of this competition, as many of you may know, is to raise awareness of the environmental, social, and governance-based principles of investing, and particularly in fixed income markets. Although we do accept submissions that are somewhat broader than purely fixed income. And at a time when there are many conflicting views and claims and perspectives involving the entire spectrum, entire political spectrum, and we hear sometimes pushback efforts and comments coming from political, regulatory, and financial quarters. It is particularly important now to stimulate and promote both meaningful conversation and research. And that's the goal of this competition, which we all think. And on behalf of the entire group that looked at the submissions, we are very happy to say that we do feel that this particular mission was very well served this year. As Henry mentioned, there is one first prize, one winning paper, and that paper is presented by Mayank Kumar. He is a doctoral student at the Ross School of Business at University of Minnesota, and his work was thought by everybody in the group to be particularly relevant and thought-provoking. And again, as I said, I don't want to stand in between his presentation and all of you. As Henry mentioned, please write your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom link. And without taking any more time, Mayank, congratulations. Can I invite you to present your paper? You have about half an hour, followed by Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Suresh. And before I begin, I'd like to just thank the Fixed Income Analyst Society and the Fordham University for organizing this competition and also for giving me this award. I'm very honored. And I'm also very excited to be here right now and present this paper to all of you and get your comments and questions at the end. That'll be very helpful for my paper. So let's get started. So as you can see, the title of the paper is Getting Dirty Before You Get Clean: Institutional Investment in Fossil Fuels and the Green Transition. And as the title of the paper kind of suggests, what this paper is really about is this growing concerns around the role of private equity in greenwashing. And the concern is that public companies under pressure sell these dirty assets to private equity firms who then continue to pollute, and therefore they delay our transition to green economy. As a result of these concerns, you will see news articles like this one that talks about how private equity funds are propping up oil, and they're pumping in billions of dollars of money and extending lifelines to these coal and gas power plants. So clearly there's a lot of concerns around these transactions that's happening. As a result of these concerns, many states and regulators have now begun considering to divest from fossil fuels, not only from their public equities, but also from their private equity. In fact, New York City just announced last year that 3 of their largest pension funds will no longer invest in fossil fuels through their private equity investments. So clearly, overall, the notion is that private equity firms are kind of bad for the environment. In this paper, I somewhat challenge that notion and show that private equity investment in fossil fuels can have a silver lining, in the sense that it can actually facilitate the green transition by allowing new, clean technologies to develop. So the key insight of my paper is that these old, dirty assets often provide opportunities that are valuable for the development of new, clean technologies. So for example, a coal power plant is already connected to the power grid. And this interconnection is extremely valuable for the development of renewable sources of energy, like solar. And yet, there might be financial frictions that may prevent the owners of these assets to kind of contract and realize these opportunities. And I'll talk about what these frictions are very soon. So in this paper, I show that private equity owners of these assets can alleviate some of these financial frictions and better realize these investment opportunities. To be more specific, I'll show in this paper that PE firms acquire fossil fuel plants that provide more investment opportunities for future solar generation. And then I'll show that PE acquisition of fossil fuel plants leads to more solar development in that area relative to other areas with fossil fuel plants, but no PE ownership. And therefore, any regulations or policies that prohibit institutional investment in fossil fuels may also have this unintended consequence of reducing investments in clean energy technologies. And that's kind of like the key message of the paper. So this slide kind of serves as a roadmap of my presentation today. So I'm going to start with talking about what I mean by these investment opportunities that these dirty assets provide. I'll then talk about why I think private equity firms are better able to realize these opportunities, and then we can go into the results one by one towards the end. Okay, so starting with this idea of the investment opportunity that these fossil fuel plants provide for renewable development. So solar development in the US is really an attractive asset class in general for the investors, but the key challenge or the key resistance that they face, at least in the US, is that they don't have access to electrical infrastructure. So they don't have access to the interconnection and transmission rights. And therefore, even if you can install a lot of solar panels, you can't really transmit this electricity. And this is not just a minor inconvenience. This is one of the key bottlenecks that prevents solar development from happening in the US today. It has been in media attention recently as well. So this is from CNBC last year that talks about how wind and solar power generators wait in years-long lines to put clean electricity on the grid, but then they face a lot of interconnection fees that they can't afford and they just back out of it. So this is a key problem that renewable developers, especially solar developers, face in the US today. Now, an advantage of an existing coal or a gas power plant is that it's already connected to the grid. And it has what we call the interconnection and transmission rights. Okay, so since it's already connected to the grid, if you get that right, you can use that to transmit any electricity, not just the coal and gas generated power. And once again, taking some things from the media, New York Times posted this article 2 years ago that talks about this feature that some of these old coal power plants have. So this hasn't been in the media attention a lot, but recently people have begun talking about all of these synergies that these old assets provide for solar development. Okay, so given the synergy that this coal plant provides for a solar developer, you would expect that a solar developer partners with an existing fossil fuel plant owners to kind of realize these synergies, right? So ideally, what we would expect is solar developer writes a contract with a fossil fuel plant owner and essentially uses these interconnection rights that these fossil fuel plant owners have. But there are certain frictions, specifically some contracting frictions, that may prevent such partnerships from being realized. So one of the key features of a solar power project, as you'd expect, is that it requires large upfront investments. So you have to acquire these large plots of land, install a lot of solar panels and so on. And then you had to rely on these long-term contracts with these fossil fuel plant owners to get this interconnection right. And we know by the economic theory that we've learned before suggests that whenever we have these upfront investments relying on long-term contracts, it leads to a hold-up problem, right? That the bargaining power shifts soon after you make this large investment, and therefore a solar developer might not be incentivized to put in that investment upfront. So this holdup problem is the key friction that prevents these solar developers from developing solar and contracting with the existing fossil fuel plant owners a lot of times. Now, in this paper, I argue that a private equity owner of these fossil fuel plants can help mitigate and alleviate some of these frictions. And that's mostly because of the relationships they have with other financial investors of solar projects. It's like banks, pension funds, hedge funds, and so on. So a private equity firm has repeated interaction with banks and pension funds as they have to raise money from them repeatedly. And this repeated interaction makes the flow of information, let's say about new project or contracting on these resources, easier for them. These relationships also alleviate some of these hold-up concerns because a private equity fund is incentivized to maintain these relationships for future fundraising purposes. And therefore, a pension fund is not as concerned about a private equity firm reneging from some of these contractual terms that they've signed on. So that kind of alleviates our classic hold-up problem that we think of. And these two parties together can make this relationship-based investment. And that's the argument that I'm trying to make in this paper, that this relationship helps private equity firm and these institutional investors to develop solar plants in those areas going forward. But ultimately, this is just a theory, an argument that I have so far. And ultimately, it's an empirical question to see whether this holds in the data or not. And that's where my paper comes in. So I'll put forward my hypothesis, and then I'll talk about how I test it in the data. So the first hypothesis I test is, I call it ex-ante selection, which says that if private equity firms are better able to realize these investment opportunities than other owners, then PE firms should, in equilibrium, own the fossil fuel plants that provide more investment opportunities for future solar generation. And second, exposed, we should expect solar development to increase more in areas where PE firms own fossil fuel plants, relative to other areas where some other owners own fossil fuel plants. So these are the two hypotheses that I test in this paper. And before I get to the details, let me just give you a preview of the results. First, I find that PE firms are indeed more likely to acquire and own fossil fuel plants that provide more opportunities for future solar generation. That is, they own fossil fuel plants in sunnier areas, but only after solar generation becomes commercially attractive. And this effect is stronger for smaller and older plants that really provides more investment opportunities relative to the earnings that are left from the plants themselves. On the exposed effect side, I also find that PE ownership of fossil fuel plants leads to more solar development in that county, again, relative to other counties with fossil fuel plants, but no PE ownership. And I find that this increase comes from institutional investment in solar, specifically from the investors that are related to the private equity owners of fossil fuel plants through either deals or limited partnerships. So this is the kind of like the preview of my main results. Let me get into the paper a little bit more. So before talking about these results, let me just set the scene by showing you what power plants I'm looking at in this paper. So this plot kind of plots all the fossil fuel power plants and the solar plants in the US. And the color represents whether it's fossil fuel or solar, and the size of the circle represents the capacity of these plants. And as you would expect, much of these plants are kind of concentrated in high population areas. But you'd also see that a lot of solar plants are very close to the existing fossil fuel power plants. It kind of, again, talks about speaks to the synergy that I was talking about earlier on. This is also evident if we look at how far a fossil fuel plant is from all the solar plants. So what this histogram tells you is that more than 85% of all solar plants are within 20 miles from an existing fossil fuel power plant, which again kind of gives some evidence that, well, there has to be some synergies why they are so close to each other. So it's just a good kind of descriptive stat to keep in mind as I go through my paper. Okay, so let me start with the first hypothesis that I laid out earlier. And the question here essentially is, does PE acquire fossil fuel plants that offer more opportunities for solar power? And let me just start by saying that it's really difficult to isolate a private equity firm's incentives behind acquiring an asset for future investment opportunities. And that's for two key reasons. So first, it's really difficult to measure the investment opportunity of a new technology like solar. And second, it's even more difficult to find what we call exogenous variation in investment opportunities that leave other factors like the existing assets unchanged. So for example, a statewide renewable policy would increase the solar investment opportunity of that area, but it would also affect the prospects and values of existing fossil fuel plants. So it wouldn't really be exogenous in that sense. And that's a challenge every empirical researcher has to face. So in this paper, I overcome these challenges by first measuring the solar investment opportunity using the intensity of sunlight that falls on fossil fuel power plants. And this sunlight intensity is commonly measured as what we call as global horizontal irradiance. So it's a big term, but essentially what it does is this GHI is really just the total solar radiation that falls on a horizontal surface. I get this data from a database called National Solar Radiation Database, which really provides us with an hourly measure at a spectral resolution of around 2.5 miles by 2.5 miles. So if you pick any location in the US, you take a 2.5 miles by 2.5 miles segment around that, and you can find how much sunlight falls in that area every hour. Okay. Just to give you a sense of what the heat map or the light map looks like for all the places in the US, as you would expect, the southwest part of the country receives a lot more sunlight. And as you go up, the amount of sunlight that falls kind of decreases. I'm in Michigan, and as you can see, it's virtually no sun most of the time. And so is the case in most of the New York as well. So we're not very lucky in that sense. So I collect this data, this GHI data for every segment that a fossil fuel power plant is in, and calculate an average GHI over 5 years for all of these fossil fuel plants. So showing that map with all the power plants, like once again, here the color represents how much sunlight falls on these fossil fuel plants. It again kind of pans very similar to the previous map that I showed you, which is the states in the southwest part, and within a state as well, the southwest part of each state receives a lot more sunlight. And as you go up, it receives less sunlight. Another thing to note is while there's a lot of variation across state, there's also a lot of variation within state that I'm able to exploit. So much of my analysis looks at within a state, and I'm able to exploit these variations within each state as well. Okay, so what do? I start with using this sunlight intensity measured as global horizontal irradiance. And one of the advantages of this measure is that while it's highly relevant for future solar generation, in the sense that it strongly predicts the likelihood of solar generation in that area, it's also plausibly exogenous to the value of fossil fuel plants. In that it's hard to believe that the value of a fossil fuel plant depends on how much sunlight falls on it, right? So it's exogenous in that sense. So I start with this spatial variation in the amount of sunlight that falls on these power plants. And I also make use of, sorry, this was not expected. Yeah. I hope you can still see the screen. All right. So I also make use of this temporal variation in the cost of solar development. And for that, I use the Energy Policy Act of 2005 that offered a 30% investment tax credit for any solar development. And it really made solar generation commercially attractive in the US for the first time. So essentially 2005 was kind of one of the main milestone moment in the US for solar generation. The second moment coming really now. Okay. All right, so I use these two variations together in what we call as a difference in differences setting. And essentially what this equation tells you is that I'm really comparing the propensity of a PE firm to own a fossil fuel plant in sunnier areas after the passage of this tax credit relative to less sunny areas and relative to before the passage of the tax credit. Okay, and the assumption is that, well, after the tax credit, the only thing that changed in sunnier areas is the value of these areas for future solar generation, right? I also include plant fixed effects. So we're looking within the same plant, and state by year fixed effects. So we're taking into account any time varying changes across different states. And then I also have a host of controls for the total generation, efficiency, county population, and so on. So we're trying to look at the same plant, the same area within the same time frame, and see whether there's any change in the PE propensity to own plants in those areas. All right, so this is the first main result. The table really tells you that a 1 standard deviation increase in the solar radiance increases the PE ownership of fossil fuel plants in those areas by around 3 percentage points, which is around 40% increase relative to the unconditional likelihood of around 7.5%. So unconditionally, PE firms only own 7.5% of plants. A 1 standard deviation increase in the sunlight after 2005 increases this by around 40%. So this is a substantial increase in the PE ownership after the passage of this tax credit, and therefore quite significant. Okay, so this is the first test that I was talking about, which is the ex ante effect. But perhaps economically more relevant question is, well, does solar power actually increase in these areas after PE firms own these fossil fuel plants? And to study that, I use what we call as a staggered difference in differences, which is essentially comparing solar generation outcomes in counties where PE firms own fossil fuel plants relative to other counties where PE firms don't own fossil fuel plants, other owners own fossil fuel plants, and then looking at some time frame. In my case, I look at 5 years before and 5 years after the PE ownership of the fossil fuel plant in that county. And then there are a lot of econometric methods that have changed, and I control for all of those, which is really using more saturated fixed effects, so as to make sure that these results are really driven by the effect itself and nothing else is driving my results. So I'm not going to get into the details of these methodologies, but essentially that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to compare these solar generation outcomes in these PE-owned counties with non-PE-owned counties before and after the PE ownership. To show you a dynamic effect first, what this figure is telling you is 2 things in this figure. So the first, if you look before -1, which is before PE ownership in a county, the trend, the solar generation in the counties where PE firms own fossil fuel plants have a very similar trend to the counties where there are fossil fuel plants but no PE ownership. But after PE ownership, solar generation increases more in the PE-owned counties relative to non-PE-owned counties. Okay, that's what this figure is telling you. And this increase is kind of gradual. And after the first 2-3 years, this effect becomes significant and stronger, which is also consistent with this idea that it takes 1 to 2 years for these solar development to happen. So you would expect this increase to be gradual. We also see this effect if we look at a regression table. So here, once again, what this table is telling you across all the columns is that PE acquisition leads to around 8 to 10 percentage point increase in the likelihood of solar generation in that county relative to other counties and relative to before and after. And once again, this increase is economically meaningful, given that only around 37% of counties have any solar generation. So this is roughly 25% increase relative to the unconditional likelihood. So this is the extensive margin. On the extensive margin, there's an increase in solar generation. I also see on the intensive margin that within the counties that have solar generation, the number of solar plants or the capacity of solar generation or total solar generation itself increases following PE acquisition of a fossil fuel plant in that county. Okay, so these are kind of like the 2 main results of my paper. Let me also quickly go back and talk about the mechanism as to what's driving this increase in solar generation. So if you remember in the beginning, I was talking about these relationships. So let me give you a case study that kind of points that mechanism once again. So CLECO is a regulated electric utility in the state of Louisiana, which was acquired by a Macquarie Group, which is a private equity firm, in around 2016. After this acquisition, we saw that there were a lot of solar development that was happening around the fossil fuel plants that was owned by Macquarie Group through Cleco. And these plants were being developed by a developer called Desri, which is owned by the D.E. Shaw and Company, a New York-based hedge fund. And when we look into the details of it, what I find is that there's really Macquarie Group entered into an interconnection agreement. So it partnered with D.E. Shaw and sold the interconnection rights of some of its power plants to the D.E. Shaw, which then D.E. Shaw used to develop these solar plants. Okay, so it's really that agreement that they were able to forge that was essential in development of solar. Now, on surface, these two firms look like two completely unrelated firms. Macquarie Group is from Australia. D.E. Shaw is a New York-based hedge fund. But when we look into their prior relationships, we find that Macquarie Group has previously sold several solar plants to D.E. Shaw. So they have this prior relationship together, which once again helps them in kind of alleviating some of these contractual frictions and write these kind of interconnection agreements. And that's kind of the main mechanism driving these results. So this is just a case study, but what I find is that there's a general pattern which kind of corroborates this case study quite well. So here, this table, what this table is telling you is that much of the solar development that I showed you before in the last few slides, it's really coming from institutional owners like hedge funds, pension funds, and banks developing solar in those areas. Again, not from the non-institutional solars. So it's not really the electric utilities or the independent power producers that are developing solar in these areas. It's really these institutional investors, which are basically private equity firms themselves, but also hedge funds, pension funds, who develop solar in the areas where PE firms acquire and own fossil fuel plants. When I look deeper into what the relationships are, what I find is in more than half of the cases, it's either the same private equity firm that owns solar, that owns fossil fuel plant developing solar, or it's one of their related institutional investor developing solar in that area. So if Macquarie Group owns a fossil fuel plant, we see either Macquarie Group themselves developing solar or one of their related investors developing solar in that area, which again kind of goes back to the story that I've been saying that, hey, look, this relationship between these two parties is extremely crucial for these development to happen. And that's once again kind of restating my message of the paper, which is that this relationship allows these contractual frictions to be alleviated and allows more solar development to happen in these areas. Okay, so I've been speaking for a very long time now. Let me just recap and leave you with a few key takeaways. So there are really two main points of the paper. So the first point of my paper is that these old dirty assets that we often think of often provide important and valuable opportunities for the development of new clean technologies. And therefore, who owns these assets becomes relevant for how investments in clean technologies are realized. And so any debate around divestment or investment should really consider the spillover effects of these investments on new technologies. And the second key point of the paper is from the PE side, which is that private equity owners of these assets can be efficient owners in the sense that they can better able to realize these investment opportunities, and they can be better at facilitating this transition. And therefore, any regulations or policies that impose a blanket ban on private equity investment in these assets may be counterproductive in that it may actually impede our transition to green energy rather than facilitate it. So we should keep that in mind when we think about future regulations and policies. That's all I have. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayank. That was very nice presentation. There are a number of questions. Perhaps some of them are more directly addressed towards your paper, the research, and the data, and perhaps some are directed towards a more general, questions, since you have done a lot of research in this area. perhaps you can answer some of those questions as well. Let me start with the first question, which is that, one can think of sort of two stylized ways in which PE firms can help in reducing greenhouse gas effects. One could be that they actually employ green technology in fossil fuel generation, or that they're replacing this sort of traditional fossil fuel with clean energy. Now, maybe private equity firm can help in the first direction, just learning from what your research shows, but it may delay in the second direction. So net, what's your view and what's your thought on these sort of two stylized different directions?
Yeah, no, that's such an important question, and it's a great question. The reason I didn't get into it is because it's really hard to answer this general equilibrium effect of PE acquisition of these plants, because like you mentioned, any investment kind of leads to several other effects, which is really hard to kind of encapsulate together. But the key kind of a message, at least of my paper, or the limited message so far, is that a lot of times these new investments are waiting to happen, but they just can't happen because of these frictions. So for example, solar development has been an attractive asset class, but the reason it's not happening is because they don't have the interconnection rights, and they're waiting for 4 years to just get that interconnection right. And in those cases, this ownership of these dirty assets doesn't seem to be as bad a thing, in the sense that they allow these new solar generation from happening. Of course, there are a lot of this comes with this caveat that there are a lot of other general equilibrium effects of these things, on things like how these existing plants are being run. And there are research that shows that there's no significant change in how these existing plants are run. But a general sense is that some of these private equity firms are able to shut down some of these fossil fuel plants relatively earlier as a result of these transitions. So in that sense, it still makes sense to get to this. Again, going back to my title of the paper, sometimes it's important to get your hands dirty before you get to that clean part of things, because the path to that clean energy has several frictions in it. And so that's the kind of the trade-off that we're making here. But you're right that it's really difficult to kind of estimate in a general equilibrium sense what the overall effects would be putting these two together.
No, you're very right in terms of saying that there is a typical perception about private equity firms not doing the required thing in clean energy. So there may be a perception, and you certainly explained, through your research, how some of that perception may not be correct. But in that vein, isn't it true that there is lack of transparency in the way that private equity firms work? And how does that interact with your findings? Do you think that the lack of transparency could in some ways affect these relationships that you have explored and you have examined?
No, absolutely. So that's a great point. A lot of today's kind of pressure, a lot of kind of people's quibbles around private equity really comes from this idea that they're very secretive, and there's really very little disclosure from their side. And that's certainly something which will, I think, help in general if the transparency aspect of things are improved, because like we're looking at it, a lot of times what they're doing ultimately turns out to be good for environment and so on. So if there were transparency around what they're doing, at least in my opinion, based on what I'm looking at these data, it might help private equity and not hurt them, in the sense that people's perception might change a little bit. And I don't see any direct cost of increasing transparency, at least, as long as there are no regulations that just put a blanket ban on them investing in certain things. If the regulation or policy is around them just having a better disclosure a policy, in that sense, I think that'll be a lot more beneficial, both for the society and everyone else, but also for private equity firms themselves, as it might help their perception better.
You mentioned that maybe PE firms are doing more in terms of the environment. They're doing better things about the environment that people have realized. Let me push you on that point a little further.
Yeah.
What about emissions? Do you have data on whether emissions have actually gone down through these interactions or through these activities that PE firms have done and through their...
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So on the emission side, there are two results that's kind of worth mentioning, and thanks for bringing that up. So the first thing that's been shown in the literature as well, and this part is not just my paper, which is that generally the emissions don't change from the plants after PE acquisition of that plant, in the sense that overall emissions stays more or less the same. But if you bring that result along with the result that solar generation increases in those areas, and then if you look at emissions per unit of generation or per unit of capacity of generation, you will see that emissions actually decreases then, because you now have a lot of solar development in that area, but the emissions from existing plants kind of stays the same. So overall per unit generation, the emissions are low, which is kind of, again, important for our society in that sense.
We have a number of questions, so I don't know if I'll be able to get through all of them. But here's a question on FERC, FERC. As FERC's interconnection rule comes into force, do you anticipate that the value of the old fossil fuel plants will decrease? It seems like the interconnection rights are the truly valuable part of the old fossil fuel plants. If connecting to the grid gets easier, wouldn't it make sense for private equity firms to invest directly in solar, wind, etc., and connecting to the grid?
That's such a great point, and my answer will be yes, indeed. It will be these values from these existing fossil fuel plants will certainly be lower. The fact is that in the last 10, 15 years, we haven't gotten much progress in simplifying these interconnection rules. So up until now, at least, these existing plants have been very valuable. If in an ideal world, we'll just solve this interconnection problem and we'll just have new transmission lines with a very simple and efficient interconnection process. And in that world, my entire story will really not go through. But unfortunately, we live in this kind of second or third best world where we have these frictions. And in that world, these plants are very valuable. But I agree that once these new interconnection rule goes in place, which hopefully it does, it will certainly make things a lot easier for new solar developers.
Somewhat related to the previous question, your paper, the main takeaway, at least one of the main takeaways, is the value of the grid connection. Now, am I correct in interpreting your result as saying that private equity firms are doing this better, that they are somehow more efficient in exploiting this grid opportunity? And do you see other forms of firm, collaboration?
Yeah.
Where PE firms are not involved, but the underlying economic benefit of the grid connection is still able to exploit through other forms of business combination?
Yes, indeed. So that's a great point. We are now seeing that happening through non-private equity owners as well. The point is that at least in the beginning part, for some reason, private equity firms were better able to identify these opportunities and realize these. But in the last few years, we're seeing more and more players getting into it. So there is for example, Vistra Corp and NRG Energy and many other energy power producers that are not directly owned by private equity firms are now, in fact, doing certain things which are along the same lines. So I think it was Vistra Corp or some other plant, forgetting the name of the power producer, that owned 9 coal plants in Illinois, specifically to get these interconnection rights to then develop solar in those areas. So now more and more other owners are realizing these. It just so happens that when these investment opportunities were not as obvious, and when these frictions were higher in some sense, PE firms were better able to realize those than other owners.
There's a question here that is so much linked to a lot of demands we are seeing in our campuses these days, divestment from fossil fuel. So the question is, with divestment in fossil fuels in Europe and the growing demand of divestments in the US, do you think it is still a feasible investment strategy for PE firms, or how long do you think it will continue to be a feasible strategy for PE firms?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, so that's a great point. And in fact, we are all kind of grappling with this issue right now in different sense across university campuses. The general sense or consensus, at least in the academic side, is that for divestment to be effective, certain things has to happen, right? So the first kind of criteria is that the divestment has to be sizable in the sense that a majority portion of investors need to come together to divest. If there are only a handful of investors who are divesting, it's not going to have any real effect. And second, there has to be a limited elasticity of substitution in some sense, right? So if there are enough investors willing to substitute, then once again, I, as a climate conscious investor, can divest, but if another investor who's less climate conscious buys this asset and then runs it more poorly, it has this counterintuitive effect of actually increasing the pollution. So we need to have that kind of limited elasticity of substitution in that sense. In the sense of fossil fuel, I have a sense that majority of the people, at least in the investment side and so on now, believe that climate change is real and these dirty plants need to be run more efficiently. And in that sense, I think divestment has a role to play. But overall, divestment as a strategy to bring any kind of real societal change is really difficult to kind of achieve because there are just wide variety of investors with wide beliefs. And it's really difficult to kind of bring them all together to agree on certain points, at least in this day and age.
So private equity firms, the way we have traditionally, taught our students or discussed it in class is about their role in LBOs, also their role in venture capital. What you are describing here and discussing is probably slightly different. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm saying that incorrectly or not. But in terms of the private equity firms' use of debt and equity in these deals that you have looked at, what's your takeaway from this?
Right. Yeah. So no, that's a great point. So let me also just mention one thing which I should have mentioned in the presentation, which is my results are still driven by these private equity firms being highly profit driven. They're not doing this for the benefit of the environment or anything. They're purely driven to maximize their profits. And the profits are coming from these interconnection rights by selling these rights and getting these investments in. So it's in that sense, it's very much similar to any other LBO or private equity deals that we look at, where there is some value to be kind of gained. PE firms sees those inefficiency, gets in and kind of reduces those inefficiencies overall. In these cases, a lot of these power plants are dealt in somewhat mid-sized buyouts, where essentially you do have, it's a traditional LBO structure, you have a kind of sizable debt that they take on. But again, it's kind of easier to take on these debt for these fossil fuel plants because you have these tangible assets. And most of the time, these coal and gas plants have very stable cash flow. So you're able to get a lot of debt in general on that. Having said that, the non-private equity owners of these assets also tend to take a lot of debt. So it's important to know that this whole power plant industry is generally debt driven in the sense that a lot of these assets are, have a lot of debt leverage on it. So in that sense, private equity is nothing special.
What about exit strategy?
Right. So a lot of exit in this market happens through secondary buyout. So once you buy these power plants, you sell it along to different private equity firms. And ultimately, sometimes we see them going back in public markets as well. Most of the time, what happens though is that, again, in much of my results are being driven by these old plants. And a lot of times these old plants are towards the end of their life cycle. So they're able to retire these plants by using the interconnection rights as well. So in the case of, let's say, Macquarie acquiring Cleco Group, we saw that they were able to retire some of these coal plants ahead of schedule because they were able to get into these interconnection agreements and they were able to make this money so that they can just retire these plants, which again it might be bad for the employment in that area, which it was, as it faced a lot of backlash. But overall, for the environment, it was a good thing.
Going back to an earlier question, in terms of the contracting frictions, which is what you are suggesting the PE firms perhaps solve or resolve better than other people, Are there any other forms of addressing and resolving these contracting frictions that one should expect to see? I don't know,
Yeah.
this goes back to a general equilibrium kind of question or not, but what do you see in your research in terms of other forms of remedying these kinds of contracting frictions?
Right. No,
Even
that's
in PE firms.
yeah. Yeah. So one way, so again, this is a very classic kind of underinvestment problem here. And one way to remedy this is to just acquire these assets, right? So if instead of just writing these contracts, you can just acquire these assets. So if I'm a solar developer, I have enough money, I can own these fossil fuel plants directly instead of contracting with them. But you can see the problem with that, which is that a pension fund would not want to directly own a coal plant, given how much reputational damage or liabilities that are associated with it. So there's that kind of a clientele effect going on here as well, which is that the owners of these solar developers can technically, ideally own these assets and relieve these contracting frictions, which will be the best case in the Hart and Moore kind of sense, right? The boundary of firm story. But it doesn't work here because a pension fund does not want to own a coal plant. It just wants to own the solar plant. And private equity owners kind of provides this pseudo firm boundary to these pension funds by acquiring these assets and providing these contracts. So in that sense, I think the first best would be a direct acquisition, but that comes with their own problem. Other than that, the relationship-based investment is the second best solution to hold a problem, at least theoretically.
You mentioned, perhaps in the very second slide of your presentation, if I remember correctly, that where you find PE firms getting involved with fossil fuel plants, the investment in clean energy or solar energy is actually more than would have happened.
Right.
How do you test for that?
Yeah, so that's where the staggered difference in differences comes into play, which is an empirical strategy where you look at solar generation in counties where PE firms acquire fossil fuel plants and the other counties where there are similar fossil fuel plants but no PE ownership. And then you look at certain time window. In my case, I look at 5 years, but you can also do 3 or 7 years. And then essentially the tried and tested difference in differences tests. So first thing you need to see is whether there are any pre-trends, in the sense that were they on different trends to begin with, which in my case is not the case, as I showed there was no trend before the PE acquisition. But after the PE acquisition, there's a structural change and there's an increase in solar generation. So I use that staggered difference in differences to test for that.
Thank you. I missed that. Thank you very much. But why does that happen? Why are some counties where the PE firms are not getting involved? Or is that something that you will follow in your future research? Or more, generally, because I think we are coming to the hour. So more generally, what are the next research questions that you have in mind as a follow-up to this paper?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So generally, like you mentioned, there are a lot of questions that stems from this research. One of that is just in general, the general equilibrium effect. So we look at this environment part of things, but there are a lot of other aspects like employment, or why is it that other owners are not able to realize these opportunities as well? And these are the questions that I'm really looking forward to study going forward.
Thank you. That was very interesting 1 hour. It passed very quickly. I would give the mic back to Henry. Henry, it's back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Srish, and thank you, Mayank, for a very clear presentation of not only a complex paper, but it was a long one. So you made the presentation. You made us understand it in a very clear way. Thank you. In closing, I just want to say that a copy of, again, to reiterate that a copy of your paper, as well as a recording of this a conversation, is going to be available on the FIASI website. So I encourage everyone to take advantage of that. If anyone is not a member of FIASI and participated in this presentation and would like to have more information about how to become a FIASI member, please reach out to Lauren, or you can reach out to me, and we'll be glad to help you. I should mention that there are 2 upcoming events that you should be aware of. The first one is scheduled to take place on May 30th, and that's a discussion with Michael Gatto, who recently published a book entitled The Credit Investor's Handbook: Leveraged Loans, High-Yield Bonds, and Distressed Debt. So he's going to be presenting on his new book. And also on June 11th is our annual meeting. It's scheduled to take place at 6 p.m. at the Cornell Club located at 6 East 44th Street. We hope to see you there. And the last thing I would say is that the announcements regarding the award, the competition winners, were made during our May 1 Sustainable Finance and Fixed Income Conference, which actually took place on the grounds of Fordham University campus. And the videos that captured the entire day's events will soon be posted on the FIASI website. And we encourage you to check in and check them out. So with that, I'll say again, thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Bye-bye.